Hi, this is Gary Auden. I'm bringing you an Educast Rethink Testing. It's brought to you by Telecom Reseller and Tech Vision. On today's Educast, we have Chakra Davala, who is the CEO of Tech Vision. And let's talk about what we're going to talk about. What are you going to learn out of this? Because the title says Rethink Testing, and people sort of say, well, yeah, I test. Well, there's a lot more to that than just simply doing the test. How you test, why you test, what you get out of those tests. What happens? What's the penalty if you don't test? Methodologies for testing. But there's something else important. Creating a decent business case to get the funding to do the proper testing, because a lot of people figure testing is almost a no-budget item, and that's not true at all. So let's start off with this idea. What's a philosophy of testing? And I think it's more than a process. What do you think about when you say this?
So our philosophy about testing is much more about ensuring the quality and the rigor that has to go through to make sure that the solution is working to the expectation of what the customer is going to use that product for or solution for, whether it is from reliability to making sure that the product will work when they deploy it, right? So when you test it, our testing philosophy, one of the key things that we focus on is testing in real-world deployment scenarios, not in some simulated environment. Because if you look, companies do testing, but if you test it in a simulated environment and then expect that that solution would work when you go deploy it, many times we have seen the product teams, product managers are surprised to see that, hey, we tested this, but it doesn't work in the field when I deploy it. So that's where our philosophy of testing in the real world comes into play. So reliability, quality, and testing in the real world is our philosophy.
I think one of the points I think you should make is that when you test with simulations, you're testing against assumptions, and the real world has a lot of assumptions of its own. Isn't that right?
That is very true, because in the real world, the assumptions will change compared to the assumptions that are made when a product team develops the requirements, and and the testing is always, as we all know from a basic development life cycle, that the testing is testing the requirements. But those requirements and assumptions vary when you go into a real-world environment where customers deploy it in ways that the product teams never thought that they could be deployed. So there are a lot of variations like that. So that's why we recommend testing in the real world before you deploy it, even though the product documentation says it could support it.
That gets into that point of why test. And I think what's important here is a lot of people test and then go home, and that's not really a good idea.
No, you're very right. We've been doing this for a long time, and testing and product quality is not a static thing. Just because we all know gadgets, whenever there's an update or a software update which comes in, or a security patch, you have to test it. So it is a continuous process. So why test is, you want to make sure that that solution that you're deploying can coexist and interwork with all the other components that it has to work with, right? And not to mention the risk, especially in today's day and age of security and the security threats that we're seeing day in and day out. There's constant security patches that one has to put. So that's why you have to test. You have to make sure that you're risk, you're compliant, whether it is in a corporate environment from a compliance issue perspective. Not only that, at the end of the day, you can be confident and certain that the solution after it's tested works, rather than taking some defensive posture that there is some problems, it's not an issue with the product.
I think one of the points you're making is a lot of people should elevate testing to a higher level and as a more important project. So why are we pushing rethinking testing?
You phrased it so well there. One of the things that everybody looks at testing as such a downstream process that, oh, I have developed everything, I got the product, and let's just test it and make sure once it's tested, yeah, I know it will work. But if you look at today's networks, and they're much more complex. There are so many different moving components in it, like multiple vendors. And another big thing that is happening in the industry today is the agile development methodologies, right? The DevOps, where it has kind of completely shaken up how products are developed and how testing was part of that process. So one has to rethink how these solutions are tested. You cannot take a decade-old processes and say it will work today, because the networks, as I just made the comment early on, the number of updates. I don't know if you're familiar, Gary, that many of us in some form or fashion use cloud services, right? I won't name the vendor, but I get weekly email saying that there is a software update or patch or something going on the cloud, right? So when that goes on, we have to relook at testing and say, are we doing the way we're supposed to be doing? Can it be done differently? How do I continuously ensure that the product and the solution quality is there?
I think there are two problems that I find in testing, and that is, one is the quantity of devices that you have to test, and secondly, the fact that they're not really stable devices. They keep changing in time. How do we rethink this now?
Yeah, you're correct. So we have taken a hard look at this, because over the years we've done so many of these tests as independent activities, right? As a certain task. But the more and more we looked at it, the best way and the only way we think we could scale our testing ability is through automation, because there are two things that it would solve. One is, first, that we can get the consistent quality, because unlike in the past, a certain version can be tested, a certain engineer or somebody would test it. But today, when the network is constantly evolving, it's become so organically growing, then the testing has to be continuous. If the testing has to be continuous, the only way that can be achieved is through automation. Recently I saw a very nice article about this. There was a lot of question about how DevOps is kind of completely upending the traditional models of testing and how automation has to be. And we are completely supporting that. So we believe that automation is the way to move forward, and one has to be able to test these things, not having to sit in front of the product to be able to test. I should be able to test whether it is in a cloud, in a hybrid environment, or a private cloud, right, or in a premise environment. So being able to test remotely and automatically is the way to rethink testing in the future.
I think there's one other point that is also important. The test period, the actually elapsed time in testing, is shortened significantly by automation. Isn't that correct?
It is. It helps you, cut down the number of time it takes to test. And the second thing is, you can test every small change in the network. That is the only way you can be certain that any changes that you've done are valid. Like, we've all come from the old TDM days. The networks used to be so static. I'm sure many of our listeners, and you're familiar too. Most of the operators used to have a moratorium period, actually, between Thanksgiving and Christmas, and many of them still do it, where they don't touch the network, they don't do the upgrade, anything like that. And the reason was that because before they do anything, they have to test a lot of stuff and make sure it works. But that is no longer valid moving forward when the networks are partially owned by the enterprise itself, partially in the cloud, and it's all hybrid. So the concept of the moratorium period will go away. So you have to do more testing and continuously, and automation is the only way.
Now, let's assume that I am in an IT department, or I'm working as a consultant or a VAR or whatever it may be. You've mentioned some, but what are the benefits I could use to justify this testing effort?
Yes. So first and foremost, one has to look at testing as not as a defensive approach. So a lot of times people say, "Oh, I need to test to make sure that this solution, this thing, so that way I can protect." But it should be more approached as just like if you see any IT teams, right? They issue an RFP, they get the requirements, and there's a process. But nowhere do you see generally that testing started from a testing perspective and making sure that test also becomes a very critical component of it. So the benefits when you do look at it from a testing lens is you can recognize, you'll know when you did the RFP, when the solutions that were submitted, can I accelerate the value? Can I get the value of the solution that I'm looking for rather than waiting and deploying it? If you can test it upfront, as soon as the RFP responses come in, can I create this in a network, in a smaller pilot version, validate it? You can recognize the value of the dollar that you spend on that much faster than waiting after you deploy everything, right? So it reduces your cost. You don't have to risk, turning up a few sites and realizing how, the rollouts have failed, or you have to go back and explain to your CFO or CTO, whoever. All of that will go away. And rolling out, you'll know what the challenges are when you're testing of adoption. So I'll give you an example. So let's say, for example, you're deploying a whole UC solution into your corporate environment. Probably the technology, you pick the right vendor, everything is working, but you did not realize the user adoption challenges because there is a certain, let's say, user experience quirkiness. If you would have tested it and validated it, you could have found that, and you could prepare your process of rolling out that service in such an efficient way where the quality of that service will improve and the user adoption will also improve. So sometimes those are all overlooked unless you test them in an environment where, before rolling out into the field, right? So there are many, many benefits like that. So they have to be looking at it from a holistic way of, test first kind of approach.
Now, you've been talking about the benefits, but I think the next slide really deals with the penalties. What if you don't test or don't test enough?
Yes, and one of the biggest, it's funny, of course, we're all, into NFL football, right? I heard this from one of the coaches, I think, saying that a hope is not a strategy for winning, right? Hope to win. So in the same way, I mean, hope is not an approach for quality, right? So you have to, you want to make sure that you don't lose your reputation when you roll out a service and hope that it will work based on some paper or some document or something like that. And not to mention the inordinate amount of money that you'll be spending on it, the loss of revenue and the loss of productivity and everything, right? So the cost of those things is significantly high when you don't test. So that is why it is very important. We highly recommend that these solutions, should be tested, and the cost to test is much less than the cost of failure.
Yes, and the cost of fixing things after that.
Of course, not to mention, right? And that's only if after I fail, I can keep my job.
Let's move on. You're from TechVision, and TechVision is a name that most people don't know. Maybe providers know it or people who are developers. What is TechVision, and how does it fit into an environment that I should know about as an enterprise?
Yeah, we have been in business for 15 years, Gary. So we are the subject matter experts, especially when it comes to testing in the unified communications or business communications, as today it's evolving into, right? So we have had a legacy of being the preferred test partner, vendor, however you want to call it, of all the major UC leaders, challengers of the Gartner's Magic Quadrants. You take any of them in any of those quadrants, they're all our partners, and we are their preferred testing lab, right? So we've been in business for a long time. We have an office here. We're headquartered in Plano, Texas, and of course we have a couple of other, one office in Chennai and in London. So we're a private company. We're not funded by any venture fund. We're profitable, and as I said, we've been doing hundreds of these solution tests for over many years. For example, service providers, a number of all the major U.S. carriers, especially those offering business communications, are our partners, customers. So we test a lot of those solutions for them.
I've encountered you in one area which is important. That's a SIP trunk testing service. But I didn't realize you had all these other services available. Would you go through those?
Yes, absolutely. So, we call what's called TechVision Labs. That's a testing services. We work with a lot of partners offering testing as a service. So that way we can be their extended lab team in addition to their test teams to do that end-to-end solution testing. And of course, like you said, SIP trunking. As I mentioned, a large number of the service providers, we do SIP trunk testing for them. So many of the configuration guides that if you don't get it, you should ask your service provider to provide those. We develop those, and of course they're branded as their documents, but we're the brains behind that. In addition, what we have created is what's called OnTap. We created these virtual labs in the cloud. So if anybody wants to use an enterprise UC deployment to test their a patch or an upgrade or a software patch to see what it happens, they don't have to go build the labs. And just to give you a statistic, right? 68% of corporate IT teams don't have a backup or a lab system. So they put patches or upgrades into the production network. So we created this virtual lab so that way they don't have to go create the whole thing. They can just reserve it. It's just ordering a pizza or like renting a car or something. You just rent a lab, test as you want, and if you're done, you can just archive it and you can come back. And then of course OnPoint, which is the test automation as we talked earlier a little while ago. So we automated the whole testing and we're offering it as a service. So where anybody wants to do, for example, an enterprise wants to, let's say they have a Cisco call manager deployment of 5,000 users, right? They can use this to test whether a certain upgrade rollout work and make sure all the different sites at different time zones are all working. And since it's all automated, zero touch, you can just schedule it and say run it tonight, and by Monday morning, I know all my phones are working. So that's the automation part. So OnRamp is a service that we started to help the cloud migration customers. So one of the problems that a lot of the customers moving from the premise to the cloud is when they have these UC deployments which have evolved over multiple years. The dial plans, the different site information, and all of that is all very dispersed. It's hard to collect that information. So we have developed some processes and some tools to help collect all that information and help migrate that data to be pushed back into the cloud, so that way the customers can move to the cloud. So that's our OnRamp service.
Now the next slide I think is kind of important because you bring up something that I don't hear very often, the word guarantee. And you posit that word guarantee as part of trust. What does this mean to me?
Yeah, so one of the things that we were discussing internally was, when customers come to us for testing, they take those results and they push them out to the field, and people are taking these results to deploy solutions which in many cases could be very business critical. For example, we test a lot of the trading systems in the financial services market. So those trading systems are business critical. If something doesn't work, a trader will lose, as we can all imagine, millions of dollars. So we wanted to hold ourselves accountable for the quality of the work we're doing. So that's how we started this called TechVision Verified Guarantee. So what we're saying is, if we have tested a solution, and if you deploy that solution the way we tested it and the versions and the features, then we will stand by those results. So think about this, Gary. How many teams, product teams, they have test teams. So the test teams test, but then a support team, which is completely different, will have to be testing it. Whereas what we are saying is, hey, we are testing that product, you deploy, we will stand by the results. You can call us if you have a problem. We will help you figure out whether it was deployed incorrectly, or if it's a version mismatch, or if you have done some mistake, then we can go validate that solution again for you. So that's the TechVision Verified Guarantee. And you were right. I think there is I don't think there's anybody who's offering such a service guarantee. I mean, you hear product guarantees. How many times have you seen, even outside of technology industry, service guarantee?
Now that brings us up to the term OnPoint, which is what you were talking about earlier, the automation of all of this environment.
So as I was saying earlier, we have to rethink testing, right? That's the way that we can evolve our solutions as the technology is evolving into the cloud, into the hybrid deployment. And we took many of the automation components that we did, and we put that into our OnPoint offer. So if you look at it, if you look at network as one and as an entity, the inputs into that are the endpoints, whether it is a hard phone or a soft phone or whatever the case may be. So if we automate that and then be able to inject those actions or events that go into this network through those real endpoints, which could be like hard phones or soft phones, as I said, then you can really test that network to end without having to manually interject. And that is what we did with OnPoint, where we automated how to drive these soft clients and the phones and so on. So that way we are testing these networks in real world environment as they're deployed. So that is what our OnPoint offer is.
Now that takes us into the next question, a little more explanation of how this all works.
Yeah, so in order to make it very easy for our customers, so what we have done is we made it broke it down into 3 easy steps. So if somebody wants to test, if they can create us as a site or another network within their, if it's a UCaaS provider, and then provision 3 or 4 phones. That's it. We have automated already prepackaged test plans which come into the which come with OnPoint, and we can start testing. So what happens is the OnPoint will talk directly to the phones and drive those calls or features that you want to test the network. So it's as simple as provision us as a site. We'll put 3 or 4 phones. You can provide those phones, and off you go. You can start testing at that point. It's that simple.
Now, the next page points out a number of devices you currently support, but I imagine also that this list is going to continue growing in the future.
Oh, absolutely. So we're already getting a lot of requests to support not just these 2 vendors, but we have a very busy roadmap of supporting other vendors and other devices, and we're looking at testing video streams also, video endpoints, automated video endpoints. So there's a lot of automation that is in the roadmap for us. Absolutely, you're right.
Now, you have this as a licensed option, and would you help us figure out whether the select or the ultimate is the right solution?
Yeah, so we try to create these 2 packages based on the need of how you're going to test. Like, for example, some vendors may want to do a continuous testing, depending on the type of service you have. For example, let's say you're a call center, and you want to make sure that your phones are working every morning by the time in that time zone when the agents come in. So you may want to have an automated test just to make sure all the calls, all the routing, everything is in place working, and come morning your agents are not losing any time and they can just log in and everything works. So in that case, your testing, you would want to go for an unlimited package, which is the ultimate package. Or you may be an enterprise where you want to just test, have a couple of patches that you upgrade into your network every quarter. You may want to, just test those when those patches are upgraded quarterly. In that case, you would go for a select package, which is the number of how many iterations of those tests that you can do is limited. But in the unlimited package, not only like in that call center example that I was giving, you could get an update report of whether the phones are working, what the status of the phones, and all of the stuff. Whereas in a corporate environment, you want to just test after a patch or a software upgrade is done. In that case, you don't need it. So it depends on the need. So we have created a couple of packages.
You provide on the next page a picture of your intuitive interface. And one of the questions that came up to me is this the kind of interface where I don't need a lot of training to understand it?
Exactly. You're so right. So we try to package it such that not only do you need much training at all, if any, the usage is also so simple because, like I said, it's all prepackaged with test plans and test cases. You can select that. If there's any customization, we will help customize that test plan. And it's just scheduling and run, and then go look at the logs and see what worked and what didn't. And of course, we're always here, being the subject matter experts of UC, to help you if there's any issues with why a certain call type didn't work, or if you need any consulting or something like that.
Now, this comes down to budgeting. Let's compare the manual process, which I've done for years, and the OnPoint process, and what does it mean to the customer?
Yes. So we try to put this, so obviously, right, I mean, we're all, everybody who wants to buy something has to make a business economical decision at some point, saying, okay, does it make sense? What is the cost benefits of it? So we try to put an example of what does it take if I have to test my network, or whether it is in my corporate network or a network at ITSP who provides some services. So we just took some examples and say, okay, if you do so many tests, as in this example, I think we are, let's see, we're doing about number of tests are 8, and we're saying average test time for test is 4 weeks. That is not very unreasonable. Typically, it takes about that time, if not longer. And we said, okay, how long does it take? We converted it to man hours, and using OnPoint, as you can see the numbers there, it is significant, right? I mean, it is, it's almost like 10%. It takes 10% of the, 10% of the time what it would take manually to test the same amount of tests, because all of that is automated. You just run it. You kind of spend the time reviewing and documenting and things like that, not so much on actually running it. So the cost savings are from the time and money are significant. That way, you're not wasting your scarce engineering talent on running these tests, and they're spending the time on designing and developing some new innovative stuff for you guys.
I think this slide actually is the most important one you have in this whole presentation, because if I can't justify it, I really can't buy it. Thank you very much for your time. I'd like to point out that there are a number of resources available to those who are viewing today. And so there are blogs and product information, and a demo is available as well. This is the contact information you should be using to contact TechVision. And I thank you and everyone for viewing this Educast.
Thank you very much, Gary. Thank you all.